Hi, I'm Emma. 3 hours before my wedding ceremony, I discovered my sister Sophie had systematically destroyed every detail I'd spent months planning. The flowers were wrong, the cake was missing, and my dress had been mysteriously altered to not fit. She stood there with fake concern, offering to save the day with her backup plans that just happened to match her own wedding aesthetic perfectly. But what she didn't know was that her fiancé Daniel had been documenting her schemes for weeks, and he was about to reveal the real reason he proposed to her in the first place. Sometimes the person trying to steal your spotlight ends up illuminating their own darkness instead. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of September 15th started like any other Saturday, except it was supposed to be the most important day of my life. I'd been planning this wedding for 8 months, every detail carefully chosen and coordinated. Michael and I had dreamed of a simple but elegant outdoor ceremony at Riverside Gardens, surrounded by the people we loved most. What I didn't expect was to wake up to a text message that would unravel everything I thought I knew about my own family. The message came from Tyler, our photographer, at 6:30 in the morning. "Emma, I'm so sorry, but there's been a mix-up with your timeline. Sophie called last night and moved your ceremony photos to 4 p.m. instead of 2 p.m. She said you'd approved the change because of weather concerns, but I wanted to double-check, since this affects the golden hour shots you specifically requested." I stared at my phone screen, still groggy from sleep. Weather concerns? I checked the forecast immediately. Clear skies, 72 degrees, perfect conditions. I hadn't approved any timeline changes. And more importantly, Sophie had no authority to make decisions about my wedding photography. She wasn't even in the wedding party, having declined my invitation to be maid of honor months earlier, claiming she was too busy with her own wedding planning. I called Tyler back immediately. "I never approved any changes," I told him, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "My ceremony is definitely at 2 p.m. Can you still make it work?" There was a pause on the other end. "Of course, but Emma, there's something else." Sophie also called the florist yesterday. Rose and Thorn Florals contacted me because they were confused about delivering 2 completely different arrangements to the same venue on the same day. Apparently your sister ordered a backup bouquet and centerpieces in case yours didn't work out. My stomach dropped. A backup bouquet? White roses and baby's breath, instead of the peonies and eucalyptus you chose. She told them your original flowers were looking wilted, and you'd panic if you saw them, so she wanted to have alternatives ready. The florist was calling me because they know I usually coordinate with the couples directly, and they thought it was strange. I was fully awake now, my heart racing. I thanked Tyler and immediately called Rose and Thorn Florals. The conversation that followed confirmed my worst fears. Sophie had indeed ordered a completely different floral arrangement, claiming to act on my behalf. She'd even put her own credit card down as payment, telling them I was too stressed to handle the details, and had asked her to take care of everything. "We were actually relieved when she called," the florist explained. "Your original peonies have been beautiful, but she seemed so concerned about them not being perfect for such an important day. She said you have anxiety about these things, and she didn't want you to worry." I had never expressed anxiety about my flower choices to anyone, least of all to Sophie. In fact, I'd specifically chosen peonies because they reminded me of our grandmother's garden, where Michael had first told me he loved me. Sophie knew this story. She'd been there when I explained my choice to our mother, rolling her eyes and commenting that peonies were so overdone and that roses were more classic. After hanging up with the florist, I sat on the edge of my bed, trying to process what was happening. 2 major vendors had been contacted by my sister, both with stories about me being anxious or unprepared, both with her offering solutions that just happened to align with her own aesthetic preferences. This wasn't coincidence. I called Michael even though I knew he was probably still asleep at his brother's house where he'd stayed the night before the wedding. He answered on the 3rd ring, his voice thick with sleep. "Emma? Everything okay? I think Sophie is sabotaging our wedding," I said, the words feeling surreal as they left my mouth. There was silence on the other end. Then Michael's voice, much more alert now. "What do you mean?" I explained about the photographer and the florist. As I talked, I could hear Michael moving around, probably getting dressed. "That's really strange," he said finally. "But maybe she's just trying to help?" You know how she gets when she thinks she knows better. This was true. Sophie had always been the type to take charge, to assume she knew what was best for everyone around her. Growing up, she'd rearranged my room while I was at school because she thought my furniture layout was inefficient. She'd thrown away clothes from my closet that she deemed unflattering. Our parents had always praised her initiative, calling her helpful and organized, while I learned to quietly fix things after she'd improved them. But this felt different. This was my wedding day, and these weren't small suggestions or helpful tweaks. These were major changes made without my knowledge or consent, accompanied by stories about my supposed anxiety and inadequacy. "I'm going to call the cake place," I told Michael, just to check. Sweet Dreams Cake Studio had been my first choice from the beginning. I'd fallen in love with their portfolio, specifically a 3-tier vanilla cake with lavender buttercream and fresh berries. It was simple, elegant, and perfect for our garden setting. The baker, Maria, had worked with me for weeks to get the design exactly right. When I called, Maria's voice was immediately apologetic. "Emma, I'm so glad you called. I was going to reach out this morning anyway. Your sister stopped by yesterday afternoon with some concerns about your cake." My hands started shaking. "What kind of concerns?" "She said you'd been having second thoughts about the lavender flavor, that you were worried it might be too unusual for your guests. She seemed to think you'd been losing sleep over it but were too embarrassed to call and make changes this close to the wedding. She offered to handle the conversation for you." I closed my eyes, feeling sick. "And what did she suggest?" "A classic vanilla cake with white buttercream roses. She said it would be much more appropriate, and that you'd be relieved to have something traditional. She even brought photos of cakes from her own wedding planning to show me what she meant." Her own wedding planning. Sophie's wedding was still 3 months away, but she'd been documenting every detail on social media, creating mood boards and inspiration posts that featured white roses, classic vanilla cake, and what she called timeless elegance. Everything she'd tried to change about my wedding matched her own aesthetic exactly. "Maria," I said carefully, "please don't make any changes to my original order. I love the lavender cake we planned, and I never asked my sister to speak on my behalf." "Of course," Maria said, sounding relieved. "I have to admit, I was surprised. You'd been so specific about wanting something unique, and you seemed so excited about the lavender. I'm glad I waited to hear from you directly." After hanging up, I sat in my apartment, looking around at the organized chaos of wedding preparation. My dress hung on the closet door, carefully steamed and ready. My shoes were laid out, along with the jewelry Michael's grandmother had lent me. Everything I'd chosen with care and excitement, now feeling somehow tainted by the knowledge that Sophie had been working behind the scenes to undermine it all. I needed to see the dress. Something was nagging at me, a terrible suspicion that I couldn't shake. I'd had my final fitting just a week ago, and everything had been perfect. But if Sophie had gotten to the photographer, the florist, and the baker, what else might she have interfered with? Bella's bridal boutique opened at 9 on Saturdays. I called as soon as they unlocked their doors. "Emma, happy wedding day." The voice belonged to Sarah, the seamstress who'd done all my alterations. "I hope you're not calling with last-minute worries. Your dress looked absolutely perfect when you picked it up." "When I picked it up?" I repeated. "I haven't picked it up yet. It's supposed to be delivered this afternoon." There was a pause. "Oh no, there must be some confusion. Your sister picked it up yesterday evening. She had your authorization form and everything. She said you were too busy with other wedding preparations and had asked her to handle the pickup." My blood ran cold. "What authorization form?" "The one with your signature, giving her permission to collect your dress on your behalf. She seemed to know all the details about your alterations, and she had your phone number and wedding date." I have to admit, I was a little surprised you'd trust someone else with your dress on such an important day, but she assured me you'd specifically asked her to take care of it. I was already grabbing my keys, my mind racing. "Sarah, I never signed any authorization form. I never asked my sister to pick up my dress. Where is it now?" "She said she was taking it straight to your apartment building," Sarah said, her voice now tinged with worry. "Emma, if there's been some kind of mistake..." "I'll be right there," I said, hanging up and rushing out the door. The drive to Bella's took 12 minutes that felt like hours. When I arrived, Sarah was waiting with a file folder and a concerned expression. She handed me the authorization form, and I stared at my own signature at the bottom. Except, it wasn't my signature. It was close, very close, but the loops in my letters were slightly different, the pressure of the pen not quite matching my usual writing style. "This isn't my signature," I told Sarah, pointing to the subtle differences. Sarah examined the paper more closely. "Oh my God, you're right. I'm so sorry, Emma." She was so confident, and she knew so many details about your order. I never thought to question it more carefully. "What exactly did she say when she picked it up?" "She said you were having a small panic attack about fitting into the dress after gaining a few pounds from wedding stress, and that you'd asked her to bring it to you so you could try it on privately without the pressure of being in the shop. She seemed so concerned about your emotional state." Another story about my supposed anxiety and inadequacy. Another narrative that painted Sophie as the helpful sister managing my supposed meltdowns. I was starting to see the pattern clearly now, and it was making me furious. "Did she try the dress on or examine it while she was here?" Sarah hesitated. She did ask to see it out of the bag, just to make sure it hadn't been damaged during storage. That seemed reasonable, but now that I think about it, she spent quite a bit of time looking at the alterations we'd made. She even asked specific questions about the measurements. I needed to find my dress immediately. I called Sophie's number, but it went straight to voicemail. I tried her apartment, but there was no answer when I knocked on the door. Finally, I called our mother. "Emma, sweetheart, you should be getting ready." Mom's voice was cheerful and excited. "Are you feeling nervous?" "That's completely normal." "Mom, do you know where Sophie is?" "She picked up my wedding dress yesterday, and I need to get it from her." "She picked up your dress? That was sweet of her to help." "She's probably at the venue already, decorating. You know how she loves to make sure everything looks perfect." "Sophie was at the venue." "Of course she was." I drove to Riverside Gardens, my anxiety mounting with every mile. When I arrived, I found her in the bridal suite, hanging white roses and baby's breath around the mirror where I was supposed to get ready. She looked up when I entered, her face immediately shifting into an expression of surprised concern. "Emma, you're here so early. I thought you'd be relaxing this morning, maybe getting a massage or something. You look really stressed." "Where's my dress, Sophie?" "Your dress?" "It's right here." She gestured to a garment bag hanging on the back of the door. "I picked it up for you yesterday because I knew you had so much to handle."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Wanted to make sure it got here safely. I walked over to the garment bag and unzipped it slowly. Inside was my dress, but something was wrong. The bodice looked different, tighter somehow. I pulled it out completely and held it up to examine it more closely. The alterations had been changed. The dress I'd carefully fitted to my body had been taken in at the waist and bust, making it at least 2 sizes smaller than what I'd ordered. If I tried to put this on, it wouldn't zip, and even if it did, I wouldn't be able to breathe or move comfortably. "Sophie," I said quietly, "what did you do to my dress?" "What do you mean?" "I didn't do anything, I just picked it up for you." "This dress has been altered again. It's too small now." Sophie moved closer, examining the dress with a frown. "Are you sure? Maybe you're just feeling bloated from wedding stress." I read that brides often gain weight right before their wedding because of anxiety eating. There it was again. The narrative about my supposed emotional instability. My supposed weight gain. My supposed inability to handle my own life. Sophie had created a story where she was the competent sister helping her anxious, unreliable sibling, and she'd been telling this story to every vendor, every family member, anyone who would listen. "Sophie, I tried this dress on a week ago and it fit perfectly. Someone has altered it since then, and you're the only person who's had access to it." "Emma, you're being paranoid. Why would I do something like that? I'm trying to help you." But as she spoke, I noticed something else. Hanging in the corner of the bridal suite was another garment bag, one I didn't recognize. I walked over to it and unzipped it partially. Inside was a white dress. Clearly a wedding dress, but not mine. This one was simpler, more traditional, with white rose appliques and a classic silhouette. It was exactly my size. "What's this dress, Sophie?" "Oh, that's just a backup." I thought it might be good to have options, just in case there were any problems with your original dress. You know how these things can go wrong at the last minute. I stared at her, finally understanding the full scope of what she'd done. Sophie hadn't just been sabotaging my wedding details. She'd been systematically replacing them with her own preferences, creating problems with my choices so she could swoop in with solutions that happened to match exactly what she wanted for her own wedding. The white roses instead of peonies, the vanilla cake instead of lavender, and now a traditional dress instead of my carefully chosen gown. Sophie, this is insane. You've been sabotaging my wedding so you could preview your own aesthetic. You've been lying to vendors, forging my signature, and altering my dress. That's ridiculous, Emma. You're being completely irrational. I've been trying to help you because you clearly can't handle the pressure of planning a wedding. Look at yourself right now. You're having a breakdown over flowers and cake flavors. But I wasn't having a breakdown. For the first time all morning, I was thinking clearly. Sophie had been gaslighting me, making me doubt my own choices and my own capabilities, while positioning herself as the calm, competent sister who could fix everything. She'd been practicing for her own wedding by taking over mine. I pulled out my phone and started making calls. First to Rose and Thorn Florals, confirming that my original peony arrangements were ready and could be delivered as planned. Then to Sweet Dreams, making sure my lavender cake was still available. Finally to Tyler, our photographer, confirming the original timeline we'd agreed on. While I made these calls, Sophie watched me with growing irritation. When I finished, she crossed her arms and glared at me. "You're making a huge mistake, Emma. Those vendors will think you're completely disorganized, changing everything back at the last minute. People are going to talk about what a disaster your wedding was. The only disaster here is what you've done," I replied calmly, "and I'm going to fix it. You can't fix it, your dress doesn't fit, your flowers are going to look cheap, and your cake is going to taste weird. Everyone's going to know you made poor choices." I looked at my sister, really looked at her, and for the first time I saw past the helpful facade to the deep insecurity underneath. Sophie wasn't trying to help me. She was trying to prove that she could do everything better than I could, that her taste was superior, that she was the more competent sister. My wedding had become her testing ground. "Sophie," I said quietly, "why are you doing this?" For a moment her mask slipped, and I saw something raw and vulnerable in her expression. But then she composed herself again, returning to the concerned sister persona. "I'm not doing anything except trying to save you from embarrassing yourself. But if you want to be stubborn about it, that's your choice." She gathered her things and headed toward the door, but then she paused and turned back to me. "By the way, Daniel's going to be here soon to help with setup. He's been amazing through all of this, so supportive of my efforts to help you. It's nice to have a partner who appreciates when you go out of your way for family." After she left, I sat alone in the bridal suite, surrounded by the evidence of her sabotage. The wrong flowers, the altered dress, the backup plans that all happened to match her own wedding vision. I needed help, but more than that, I needed someone who would believe me and take this seriously. I called Ashley, my maid of honor, and explained everything that had happened. Ashley listened without interruption, and when I finished, there was a long pause. "Emma," she said finally, "this is beyond normal sibling rivalry. This is deliberate sabotage. We need to document everything and figure out how to fix this before your ceremony. I don't even know if my dress can be fixed in time. We'll figure it out. But first, we need to make sure Sophie can't do any more damage. Do you have any idea why she's doing this?" I thought about Sophie's comment about Daniel being supportive of her efforts to help me. Something about the way she'd said it struck me as odd. Almost like she was trying to convince herself as much as inform me. "I think she's using my wedding as practice for her own," I said. "Like she's testing out all her ideas to see how they look in reality before committing to them for her own day." "That's sick, Emma. Your wedding isn't her personal mood board." Ashley was right, but there was something else bothering me, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Sophie's behavior was extreme, even for her. The level of planning and coordination required to sabotage this many vendors suggested someone who was either completely obsessed or completely desperate. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Emma, this is Daniel, Sophie's fiancé. Can we talk privately before your ceremony? It's important." Daniel's text message felt like a lifeline in the chaos Sophie had created. I responded immediately, asking him to meet me at the small gazebo behind the main event space, away from where Sophie might see us talking. Within 15 minutes, he appeared, looking unusually serious for someone who was supposed to be helping set up for a joyful wedding celebration. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," he said, glancing around to make sure we were alone. "I wasn't sure if you'd want to hear from me, especially today. Daniel, if you know something about what Sophie's been doing, I need to hear it. She systematically destroyed every detail of my wedding, and I'm running out of time to fix things." He nodded grimly. "I know exactly what she's been doing, because I've been watching her do it for weeks. Emma, what I'm about to tell you is going to sound insane, but I need you to know that everything Sophie has done to your wedding has been calculated and deliberate." Daniel pulled out his phone and opened a folder of screenshots. 3 weeks ago, I noticed Sophie taking detailed photos of your wedding planning materials when she visited your apartment. At first, I thought she was just interested in your choices, maybe getting inspiration for our own wedding. But then I saw this. He showed me a photo of a notebook, clearly in Sophie's handwriting. The page was titled, "Emma's Wedding Improvement Opportunities," and contained a detailed list of everything she planned to change. Next to each item was a note about how her alternative would be superior. "Peonies. Too bold and attention-seeking. Roses are more sophisticated and photogenic," I read aloud. "Lavender cake. Weird flavor that will make guests uncomfortable. Vanilla is classic and safe. Fitted dress. Too trendy and will date badly in photos. Traditional silhouette is timeless." "Keep reading," Daniel said quietly. Further down the page, Sophie had written detailed strategies for implementing these changes. "Contact vendors with concern stories. Emma's anxiety, weight fluctuations, indecisiveness. Position myself as helpful sister managing her stress. Have backup options ready that match my own wedding aesthetic. Document everything for my own planning reference." I stared at the screen, feeling sick. She's been using my wedding as her personal trial run. "It gets worse," Daniel said, scrolling to another screenshot. "Look at this." The next image showed a group chat between Sophie and several of her friends, including Jessica. The conversation was from 2 days ago, and Sophie was describing her activities with obvious pride. "I've basically taken over Emma's wedding planning because she's having such a hard time with it," Sophie had written. "Poor thing is so overwhelmed that she can't make decent decisions. I'm having to fix everything last minute, but at least it's giving me great practice for my own wedding. I'm learning so much about what works and what doesn't." Jessica had responded, "You're such a good sister for helping her. Some people just aren't cut out for event planning." "Exactly," Sophie had replied. "The sad thing is, she thinks her original choices were good. Like, she wanted peonies for her bouquet, which are so 2019. And lavender cake flavor? Who does that? I'm saving her from looking back at her photos with regret." I scrolled through more of the conversation, watching Sophie describe my supposed emotional breakdowns and poor decision-making skills with a mixture of condescension and satisfaction. She'd created an entire narrative where I was the incompetent younger sister who needed her constant intervention to avoid disaster. "Daniel, why are you showing me this?" I asked. "These conversations make Sophie look terrible, but they also implicate you. You knew what she was doing and didn't try to stop her." He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the ground. "Because I've been documenting everything for my own protection. Emma, I need to tell you something about why I'm really marrying your sister, and it's not what anyone thinks." I waited, sensing that whatever he was about to reveal would be significant. 6 months ago, I discovered that Sophie had been systematically stealing money from the real estate clients she represents. She's been skimming commission payments, hiding transaction fees, and in some cases, outright forging signatures on closing documents. I have evidence of at least 12 separate incidents totaling over $200,000. My mouth fell open. "You're saying Sophie is embezzling money?" Not just embezzling. She's been running a sophisticated fraud operation, using her position as a real estate agent to manipulate vulnerable clients, especially elderly homeowners who don't fully understand the paperwork they're signing. I found out because one of the victims was my grandmother. Daniel's voice became strained as he continued. My grandmother hired Sophie to help her sell her house so she could move into assisted living. Sophie convinced her to sign papers that she claimed were standard disclosure forms, but they were actually documents transferring partial ownership of the property to Sophie's shell company. My grandmother would have lost $60,000 if I hadn't caught it in time. How did you catch it? I'm an investment banker, so I understand financial documents. When I reviewed the paperwork my grandmother was planning to sign, I immediately recognized the fraud. But when I confronted Sophie about it, she didn't deny it. Instead, she offered me a deal. I felt a chill run down my spine. What kind of deal? She said she would stop the fraud operation and make full restitution to all her victims, including my grandmother, on one condition. I had to marry her and maintain the marriage for at least 2 years, providing her with the respectability and financial stability she needed to rebuild her career legitimately. She blackmailed you into proposing? Essentially, yes. She said if I didn't agree to her terms, she would claim that I was the one behind the fraud scheme, using her as a front to steal from elderly clients. She had created enough documentation to make it look plausible, including forged emails that appeared to come from my work account with instructions for the fraudulent transactions. I stared at Daniel, trying to process this information. But why would you agree to that? Couldn't you have just reported her to the authorities? I could have, but it would have destroyed my grandmother in the process. The stress of a criminal investigation, testifying in court, having her personal finances scrutinized publicly, it would have killed her. She's 87 years old and already struggling with early-stage dementia. Sophie knew exactly what leverage she had. Daniel showed me another folder on his phone, this one containing bank statements, forged documents, and recorded phone conversations. I've been gathering evidence for months, building an airtight case against her. My plan was to wait until after our wedding, when she felt secure in the marriage, and then present everything to the district attorney. But watching what she's doing to you today has made me realize I can't wait any longer. What do you mean? Sophie's behavior toward you isn't just about wedding planning or sibling rivalry. It's part of the same pattern of manipulation and control that she's used to defraud her clients. She identifies what people want most, then positions herself as the person who can provide it, while systematically undermining their confidence in their own judgment. I thought about all the stories Sophie had told vendors about my supposed anxiety and poor decision-making. She's been telling everyone that I'm incompetent so they'll trust her judgment instead of mine. Exactly. And once people start doubting themselves and relying on her guidance, she can manipulate them into accepting whatever she wants. It's the same technique she used with her real estate clients. Daniel's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it and frowned. Sophie's looking for me. She wants me to help her set up some decorations before the ceremony. Emma, I need to ask you something important. Are you willing to help me expose her? What did you have in mind? I want to record her admitting to what she's done to your wedding. If I can get her to confess on tape, it will be additional evidence of her pattern of manipulation and fraud. But it means your wedding day is going to become the day we take down Sophie's entire operation. I considered this carefully. My wedding was supposed to be about Michael and me starting our life together. The last thing I wanted was for it to be remembered as the day my sister's criminal activities were exposed. But I also couldn't let Sophie continue hurting people. And I couldn't let her get away with sabotaging the most important day of my life. What would I need to do? Confront her about the sabotage, but do it where I can record the conversation. She's arrogant enough that she'll probably admit to everything if she thinks she's won. And based on what I've observed, she genuinely believes she's done you a favor by improving your wedding choices. Before I could respond, we heard voices approaching. Sophie appeared around the corner of the gazebo with Jessica, both of them carrying armfuls of white roses. There you are, Daniel, Sophie called out cheerfully. I've been looking everywhere for you. Emma, I see you've met my wonderful fiancé. Isn't he amazing for helping out with your wedding setup? I looked at Daniel, then back at Sophie, noting how naturally the lies came to her. She was rewriting reality in real time, making it seem like Daniel's presence here was part of her helpful efforts, rather than his attempt to warn me about her criminal activities. Sophie, I said carefully, I need to talk to you about what's been happening with my wedding vendors. Of course, I've been handling so many details for you. It's been a lot of work, but I'm happy to help. You seemed so overwhelmed. Jessica nodded sympathetically. Sophie's been telling us how stressed you've been. It's sweet how much she cares about making sure your day is perfect. Actually, I said, I've discovered that several vendors received calls from you making changes to my orders without my permission. Sophie's smile didn't waver, but something shifted in her eyes. I wouldn't call them changes, exactly, more like improvements. When I saw how anxious you were getting about every little detail, I took the initiative to make some adjustments that would help everything flow more smoothly. Improvements, like changing my flowers from peonies to roses? Peonies are so overdone right now, Emma. Everyone's using them. Roses are classic and elegant. They'll look much better in your photos, and you'll thank me later when your wedding pictures don't look dated. And changing my cake from lavender to vanilla? Lavender is such a risky flavor choice. What if your guests don't like it? Vanilla is universally loved. It's much safer for such an important day. I glanced at Daniel, who had discreetly positioned his phone to record our conversation. And my dress? Why did you have it altered to be 2 sizes too small? For the first time, Sophie looked slightly uncomfortable. I didn't have anything altered. Maybe you've just been stress eating, which is completely normal before a wedding. That's why I brought a backup dress that will definitely fit. Sophie, I have the authorization form you used to pick up my dress. The signature is forged. That's ridiculous, Emma. You're being paranoid. I was just trying to help you, and now you're attacking me for it. This is exactly why I had to take charge of things. You're clearly not thinking rationally. Jessica stepped closer to Sophie, offering support. Emma, maybe you should calm down. Sophie has been working so hard to make sure your wedding is beautiful. Can't you just be grateful? But Daniel was watching Sophie's face carefully, and I could see him recognizing the same manipulation tactics he'd documented in her real estate fraud. She was positioning herself as the victim, making me seem irrational and ungrateful, while simultaneously maintaining that her actions were justified. Sophie, I said, keeping my voice steady, I want you to be honest with me. Did you plan these changes to my wedding because you thought they would look better for your own wedding photos? Sophie's mask slipped for just a moment, and I saw a flash of anger. Everything I did was for your benefit, Emma. If my choices happen to be superior to yours, that's because I have better taste and more experience with these things. Someone had to save you from making choices you'd regret. So you admit that you made unauthorized changes to my wedding arrangements? I made necessary improvements to prevent you from embarrassing yourself and our family. You should be thanking me, not attacking me. Daniel caught my eye and nodded slightly. We had what we needed. Sophie, I said quietly, I need you to return my original dress and leave the venue. You're not welcome at my wedding anymore. The transformation in Sophie's demeanor was immediate and dramatic. Her helpful sister facade disappeared completely, replaced by cold fury. You're making the biggest mistake of your life, Emma. Without my help, your wedding is going to be a disaster. Your flowers will look cheap, your cake will taste weird, and your dress won't fit. Everyone will know you made poor choices, and they'll all be thinking about how much better my wedding will be in comparison. There it is, Daniel said quietly, still recording. The real reason for all of this. Sophie spun around to face him, suddenly realizing that he'd been documenting her confession. Daniel, what are you doing? Getting evidence of your pattern of manipulation and fraud, Sophie. Just like I've been doing for months. Jessica looked confused, glancing between Sophie and Daniel. What's going on? Sophie, what is he talking about? But Sophie was staring at Daniel with a mixture of shock and rage. You can't use anything I just said. We're engaged. There's spousal privilege. Actually, Daniel replied calmly, spousal privilege only applies after marriage, And even then, it doesn't cover ongoing criminal activities. Which brings me to the real reason I agreed to marry you. He turned to me and Jessica, including them in his explanation. Sophie has been running a real estate fraud operation for over a year, stealing money from her clients, particularly elderly homeowners. She blackmailed me into proposing by threatening to frame me for her crimes if I exposed her. Jessica's face went white. Sophie, is this true? Sophie looked around wildly, realizing that her carefully constructed world was collapsing. He's lying. He's trying to sabotage our relationship because he's jealous of what Emma and I have as sisters. But her words sounded hollow even to her own ears. The evidence was too overwhelming, the pattern too clear. Sophie, I said, it's over. The lies, the manipulation, the fraud, all of it. You need to get help. I don't need help from anyone, especially not from you, she snapped. You've always been jealous of me, Emma. Jealous that I'm more successful, more organized, more capable. This is just your way of trying to tear me down, because you can't stand that I'm better at everything than you are. Including destroying people's lives? Daniel asked quietly. Sophie turned and walked away without another word, leaving Jessica standing there in shock. After a moment, Jessica followed her, and Daniel and I were alone again. Are you okay? He asked. I looked around at the venue where my wedding was supposed to take place in just a few hours. The wrong flowers were everywhere, my dress was unwearable, and my sister had just revealed herself to be both a criminal and someone who fundamentally resented my existence. Honestly, I don't know, I said. How do I even begin to fix this mess in time for my ceremony? We start with the things that matter most, Daniel said practically. Your dress, your flowers, your cake. Everything else is just decoration. He was right, but the scale of the problems felt overwhelming. More than that, I was struggling with the emotional impact of what had just happened. Sophie hadn't just sabotaged my wedding out of sibling rivalry or poor judgment. She had deliberately set out to undermine me because she fundamentally believed I was inferior to her and wanted to prove it publicly. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Michael. Emma, where are you? Ashley said there were some problems with vendors, but she wouldn't give me details. What's going on? I looked at Daniel, who nodded encouragingly. Michael, I need you to come to the venue right now. There's a lot to explain, and I'm going to need help fixing things before our ceremony. I'll be there in 10 minutes. While we waited for Michael to arrive, Daniel and I walked back toward the main building, surveying the damage Sophie had done. The white roses she'd arranged looked beautiful, but they weren't what I'd chosen. They represented her vision of what my wedding should look like, not mine. Daniel, I said, what's going to happen to Sophie now? I'm going to turn over all my evidence to the district attorney on Monday morning. She'll be arrested and charged with multiple counts of fraud, forgery, and theft. Depending on how cooperative she is about making restitution to her victims, she could be looking at several years in prison. And your grandmother? Will get her money back and won't have to testify in a criminal trial. That was always my primary concern. I thought about Sophie's final words to me, about how I'd always been jealous of her success and capabilities. The irony was devastating. I had been jealous of Sophie in some ways, envious of her confidence and take-charge attitude. But what I'd seen as her strengths were actually the tools she used to manipulate and control people. I keep thinking about all the times our parents praised her for being so helpful and organized, I said. They had no idea what she was really doing. Predators are often very good at maintaining positive public images, Daniel replied. That's how they get close enough to their victims to cause damage. Michael's car pulled into the parking lot and I watched him hurry toward us with obvious concern. In a few minutes, I would have to explain everything that had happened, and then we would have to decide whether to postpone our wedding or try to salvage it despite the chaos. But as I looked at the man I was about to marry, rushing to my side without hesitation or questions, I realized that Sophie had failed in the most important way. She'd tried to prove that I was incompetent and incapable of making good decisions, but she'd actually demonstrated the opposite. I'd chosen a partner who would drop everything to help me in a crisis, who trusted me enough to know that if I said there was a problem, there was a problem. Sophie had spent months trying to undermine my judgment and my choices. But in the end, the most important choice I'd ever made, choosing Michael as my life partner, was still intact. Everything else could be fixed or replaced, but what mattered most was still exactly what I'd chosen. And somehow, that realization made facing the next few hours feel not just possible, but empowering. Michael arrived breathless and immediately pulled me into a tight hug. "What's happening?" "Ashley said something about vendor issues, but your text sounded much more serious." I looked between Michael and Daniel, trying to figure out how to explain the morning's revelations without overwhelming him. "Michael, this is Daniel, Sophie's fiancé. He has some information about what Sophie's been doing that goes far beyond wedding interference." Michael shook Daniel's hand, clearly confused but willing to listen. "Okay, start from the beginning." For the next 20 minutes, Daniel and I explained everything. The fraudulent vendor calls, the forged authorization, the altered dress, and most shocking of all, Sophie's real estate fraud operation and her blackmail scheme. Michael's expression grew increasingly grim as we laid out the evidence. "So let me get this straight," Michael said finally. "Sophie has been systematically sabotaging our wedding to test out her own ideas, while simultaneously running a criminal enterprise that she's used to blackmail Daniel into marrying her." "That's correct," Daniel confirmed. "And based on the recording I just made, she's completely unrepentant about any of it. She genuinely believes she was doing Emma a favor by improving her choices." Michael ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I recognized as his way of processing overwhelming information. "Okay, first things first. What do we need to do to salvage our wedding? We can deal with Sophie's criminal activities after our ceremony." I loved him even more in that moment for prioritizing our commitment to each other over the drama swirling around us. "We need to get my original dress back and restored, confirm that our real vendors can still deliver what we ordered, and figure out how to redecorate this space to reflect what we actually wanted instead of Sophie's vision." "Where is Sophie now?" Michael asked. "She left after our confrontation, but I don't know where she went," I replied. "For all I know, she's at her apartment trying to figure out how to salvage her own situation." Daniel checked his phone. "Actually, I can track her location. We share our locations through a couples app she insisted we install. She's at your parents' house." My stomach dropped. "She's probably telling them her version of what happened. By the time we see them, they'll believe I'm having some kind of breakdown and attacking Sophie out of wedding stress." "Then we need to get there first," Michael said decisively. "But we also need backup. Daniel, can you send me copies of all your evidence? If Sophie tries to gaslight Emma's parents, we need to be able to prove what really happened." While Daniel transferred files to Michael's phone, I called my parents' house. My mother answered on the second ring, her voice strained with worry. "Emma, thank goodness you called. Sophie just arrived here very upset, saying you've been making wild accusations and threatening to ruin her engagement. She's crying and saying you've turned everyone against her. What's going on?" I closed my eyes, recognizing Sophie's manipulation tactics even through my mother's words. "Mom, Sophie has been lying to you. She's been sabotaging my wedding for weeks, and there's much more to the story that you need to hear. Michael, Daniel, and I are coming over right now with evidence." "Evidence?" "Emma, you're scaring me. Sophie said you might say things like this because you're under so much stress. Maybe you should postpone the wedding if you're feeling this overwhelmed." "I'm not overwhelmed, Mom. I'm angry that my sister has been systematically destroying my wedding while lying to everyone about it. Please don't make any decisions or promises to Sophie until we get there and you see the proof." After hanging up, I looked at Michael and Daniel. "Sophie's already working on my parents. She's probably telling them I'm having a nervous breakdown and that everything I say should be dismissed as wedding stress." "Then we stop talking and start showing," Daniel said grimly. "I have hours of recorded evidence, documented financial crimes, and her own written plans for sabotaging your wedding. Facts don't lie, even when Sophie does." The drive to my parents' house took 15 minutes, during which I tried to prepare myself for what was likely to be one of the most difficult conversations of my life. Sophie had always been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong in our parents' eyes. Convincing them that their perfect daughter was actually a criminal who had tried to destroy my wedding was going to require overwhelming evidence. We arrived to find Sophie's car in the driveway and my father's car missing. Dad's probably at his office, I realized. Saturday mornings, he usually goes in to catch up on paperwork. Sophie planned this perfectly, knowing Mom would be alone and more vulnerable to her manipulation. Michael squeezed my hand as we walked up to the front door. Whatever happens in there, we face it together. Sophie's lies can't change what we know to be true. My mother opened the door before we could knock, her face etched with worry and confusion. Emma, Sophie is in the living room. She's very upset, and I'm trying to understand what's happening between you two. Where is she exactly? I asked. On the couch with some tea. She's been crying for 20 minutes, saying you've accused her of terrible things and that you're trying to destroy her relationship with Daniel. I looked at Daniel, who nodded grimly. Mrs. Chen, I need you to know that everything Emma is about to tell you is true. I have extensive documentation of Sophie's actions, both regarding the wedding sabotage and other illegal activities. My mother's eyes widened. Illegal activities? What are you talking about? We walked into the living room, where Sophie was indeed positioned on the couch with a cup of tea, looking fragile and victimized. When she saw Daniel, her expression shifted from sorrowful to furious. Daniel, what are you doing here with them? You're supposed to be on my side. I'm on the side of truth, Sophie. Something you've apparently forgotten how to tell. My mother looked between all of us, clearly overwhelmed. Someone please explain what's happening. Sophie says Emma is having some kind of breakdown and making wild accusations. Mom, I said carefully, Sophie has been calling my wedding vendors for weeks, making unauthorized changes to everything I ordered. She forged my signature to pick up my dress and had it altered so it wouldn't fit. She's been telling people I'm anxious and incompetent so they'll trust her judgment instead of mine. Sophie immediately started crying again. Mom, see? She's saying I've been sabotaging her wedding, which is insane. Everything I did was to help her because she was so overwhelmed she couldn't make good decisions. Sophie, Daniel said quietly, show your mother the notebook. Sophie's crying stopped abruptly. What notebook? The one titled Emma's Wedding Improvement Opportunities, where you detailed every change you planned to make and why Emma's original choices were inferior to yours. My mother looked at Sophie expectantly. What notebook is he talking about? I don't know what he means. I never wrote anything like that. Daniel pulled out his phone and showed my mother the screenshot of Sophie's handwritten plans. This is your daughter's handwriting, Mrs. Chen. She documented her entire sabotage plan, including strategies for convincing vendors that Emma was too anxious to make her own decisions. My mother took the phone and read the page carefully, her expression growing more troubled with each line. Sophie, did you write this? He could have faked that somehow. People can manipulate photos. What about this? Daniel showed her the group chat screenshots where Sophie bragged about taking over my wedding planning and described my supposed emotional instability to her friends. As my mother read through Sophie's messages, her face grew pale. Sophie, these are your own words describing Emma as incompetent and overwhelming. You're talking about her wedding like it's your personal project. I was just venting to my friends about how stressed Emma has been. I never said anything that wasn't true. You said peonies were so 2019 and that Emma would regret her flower choice, my mother read from the screen. You said lavender cake was a risky choice that would make guests uncomfortable. These aren't observations about Emma's stress level, Sophie. These are criticisms of her taste and judgment. I watched my mother's face as she processed the evidence, seeing the moment when her protective instincts shifted from Sophie to me. Mom, there's more. Daniel has been documenting Sophie's real estate fraud operation for months. She's been stealing money from her clients, and she blackmailed him into proposing. Sophie stood up abruptly, abandoning her victim pose. That's a complete lie. Daniel is making things up because he wants to get out of our engagement. Am I making this up too? Daniel showed my mother bank statements, forged documents, and recorded phone conversations. Sophie has stolen over $200,000 from elderly homeowners, including my own grandmother. She threatened to frame me for her crimes if I didn't agree to marry her. My mother stared at the financial documents, clearly struggling to process what she was seeing. Sophie, please tell me this isn't true. Mom, you know me. You know I would never do anything like this. They're trying to destroy my life because they're jealous of my success. But my mother was reading through the evidence carefully, and I could see her recognizing patterns that probably made sense of things that had confused her before. Sophie, last month you paid off your credit card debt all at once. When I asked where the money came from, you said you'd gotten a large commission check. Was that money you stole from clients? I earned every penny of that money through legitimate real estate transactions. Daniel showed my mother a bank statement highlighting the specific deposits. These payments came from escrow accounts belonging to her clients. She diverted money that should have gone to the homeowners and deposited it into her personal account. My mother set down the phone and looked at Sophie with an expression I'd never seen before. Sophie, I need you to tell me the truth right now. Did you steal money from your real estate clients? I never stole anything. I took reasonable fees for services I provided. If people didn't understand what they were signing, that's not my fault. What about Emma's wedding? Did you make changes to her vendors without her permission? Sophie's composure finally cracked completely. Everything I did was to save Emma from embarrassing herself and our family. Her choices were terrible, Mom. Peonies are overdone, lavender cake is weird, and her dress was too trendy. I was trying to help her have a wedding she could be proud of instead of something that would look dated in 5 years. But they weren't your choices to make, Sophie. Someone had to make them because Emma clearly couldn't handle the responsibility. She's always needed guidance with important decisions, and this was too important to let her mess up. I watched my mother's face as Sophie revealed her true feelings about me, the condescension and superiority that had been hidden behind her helpful sister facade. Sophie, Emma is a successful adult with excellent judgment. She didn't need your guidance, and she certainly didn't give you permission to override her choices. She would have thanked me later when she saw how much better everything looked. How do you know what would look better? It's her wedding, not yours. Because I have better taste and more experience with these things. Emma's always been too quiet and passive to make strong choices. I was helping her be more decisive. Michael, who had been quietly listening to this exchange, finally spoke up. Sophie, do you understand that you've just admitted to sabotaging Emma's wedding because you think you're better than she is? Sophie looked around the room, seeming to realize for the first time that everyone was staring at her with shock and disapproval, rather than sympathy and understanding. I was trying to help my sister have a beautiful wedding. If you can't see that, then you're all against me. We're not against you, Sophie, my mother said sadly. We're against what you've done. To Emma, to Daniel, to your clients, to our family. So you're taking their side over mine? Your own daughter? I'm taking the side of truth and decency. What you've done is wrong, Sophie. All of it. Sophie looked at each of us in turn, her expression shifting from hurt to angry to desperate. Fine. If that's how you all want to play this, then you'll see what happens when I'm not around to fix everyone's problems. Emma's wedding is going to be a disaster without my help, and when it is, don't come crying to me. She grabbed her purse and headed for the door, but Daniel stepped in front of her. Sophie, I need you to return Emma's original wedding dress. I don't know what you're talking about. The dress you had altered to be too small. Where is it? I told you Emma's dress is at the venue. If it doesn't fit, that's her problem. The altered dress is at the venue. Where is Emma's original dress that fit her properly? Sophie glared at him with pure hatred. In my apartment closet, I was going to return it after the wedding. Why did you keep it? As a backup in case she came to her senses and realized the traditional dress I brought was better. Daniel looked at me and Michael. We need to get that dress and see if it can be restored in time for the ceremony. My mother stood up. Sophie, give Daniel your apartment key so they can retrieve Emma's dress. Absolutely not. That's my private property. The dress is Emma's private property, and you stole it. I borrowed it to protect it from Emma's poor decision-making. Michael's patience finally snapped. Sophie, you forged Emma's signature, lied to vendors, and have been running a criminal enterprise. At this point, we're being generous by not calling the police immediately. Give us the key. Sophie looked around the room one more time, realizing that she had lost all support and sympathy. With obvious reluctance, she pulled her apartment key from her keychain and threw it at Daniel's feet. Fine. But when Emma's wedding is a disaster because she refused my help, remember that I tried to save her from herself. After Sophie stormed out, the living room fell silent except for the sound of my mother crying quietly. I sat down next to her and put my arm around her shoulders. "Mom, I'm sorry you had to see all of this today. I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner," she replied. Looking back, there were signs. Times when Sophie's helpfulness seemed a little too controlling. Times when she seemed to enjoy other people's problems a little too much. I just told myself she was being proactive and caring. "She's very good at maintaining the right image," Daniel said gently. "That's how she's been able to defraud so many people for so long." My mother wiped her eyes and looked at me with determination. "What do you need from me to fix your wedding?" "Honestly, just your support. We need to get my dress, confirm our vendors can still deliver what we originally ordered, and redecorate the venue. But mostly, I need to know that you understand I'm not the incompetent, anxious person Sophie has been describing. Emma, you are one of the most capable and thoughtful people I know." The fact that Sophie convinced anyone otherwise just shows how skilled she is at manipulation. "Your judgment has always been excellent, including your choice to marry Michael." Michael smiled and squeezed my hand. "Thank you, Mrs. Chen. That means a lot." My mother stood up with renewed energy. "Now let's go fix your wedding. We have 4 hours until the ceremony, and I'm going to make sure it's exactly what you and Michael wanted, not what Sophie thought you should want." The next hour was a whirlwind of activity. We drove to Sophie's apartment, where we found my original dress hanging in her closet, unaltered and in perfect condition. Daniel also discovered a folder containing what appeared to be Sophie's research on my wedding, including printed copies of my vendor contracts, photos of my Pinterest boards, and detailed notes about how each element could be improved. "She's been planning this sabotage for months," Daniel observed, flipping through the folder. "This isn't impulsive behavior, Emma. This was a calculated campaign to take over your wedding." While Michael called our original vendors to confirm they could still deliver what we'd ordered, I took my dress to a local alteration shop that agreed to do an emergency steaming and pressing. My mother contacted relatives to explain that there had been vendor mix-ups that required some last-minute changes, without going into the details of Sophie's sabotage. By 2 o'clock, we were back at Riverside Gardens with my restored dress, confirmation that our original flowers and cake would be delivered within the hour, and a plan to quickly redecorate the ceremony space. My father had arrived and been briefed on the situation, and while he was clearly struggling to accept what Sophie had done, he was committed to helping us salvage the day. "I keep thinking about all the times I praised Sophie for being so helpful and organized," he said sadly, as we worked to replace her white roses with the peonies I'd originally chosen. "I was actually praising her for being controlling and manipulative." "You couldn't have known, Dad," I replied. "She's been very careful to maintain the right image." Ashley arrived with my other bridesmaids, and after a quick explanation of the morning's events, they immediately jumped in to help with the redecorating. Within an hour, the venue looked completely different, reflecting the garden party aesthetic Michael and I had originally envisioned, rather than Sophie's traditional elegance theme. As I was getting ready in the bridal suite, now decorated with my actual flowers and reflecting my actual taste, I couldn't help but think about how differently this day had unfolded than I'd expected. Instead of the peaceful, joyful preparation I'd imagined, I'd spent the morning uncovering my sister's criminal activities and fighting to reclaim my own wedding from her sabotage. But in a strange way, the crisis had clarified what really mattered. Sophie had tried to prove that I was incompetent and incapable of making good decisions, but the response from everyone who actually knew me had been immediate support and validation. My family, my friends, my vendors, and most importantly, my future husband, had all recognized Sophie's claims as lies and rallied to help me restore what she'd tried to destroy. Looking at myself in the mirror, wearing the dress I'd chosen, surrounded by the flowers I'd selected, preparing for a ceremony that would finally reflect Michael's and my actual vision for our wedding, I realized that Sophie had failed completely. She'd set out to prove her superiority, and instead had exposed her own deep insecurity and willingness to hurt others to make herself feel important. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message was short but chilling. Enjoy your disaster of a wedding. Don't say I didn't try to help you. I showed the message to Ashley, who immediately took my phone and blocked the number. Don't let her poison this moment, Emma. She's lost, and she knows it. That's why she's lashing out. Ashley was right. Sophie's final message was the desperate act of someone who had played her hand and lost everything. Her engagement was over, her criminal activities were about to be exposed, and her family now understood exactly who she really was beneath the helpful facade. As I prepared to walk down the aisle to marry the man I loved, in a ceremony that finally reflected our actual choices and values, I realized that Sophie had actually done me a favor. She'd forced me to fight for what I wanted, to stand up for my own judgment, and to recognize the strength of the support system I'd built around myself. The woman walking down that aisle was not the anxious, incompetent person Sophie had tried to convince everyone I was. She was someone who had faced a crisis with grace, gathered evidence methodically, and fought back against manipulation with truth and dignity. And that realization made me feel more ready for marriage than any amount of perfect planning ever could have. The ceremony began at exactly 2 o'clock. With sunlight filtering through the trees at Riverside Gardens and my actual peony bouquet in my hands. As I walked down the aisle toward Michael, I could see the relief and joy on the faces of our guests, most of whom had no idea how close we'd come to disaster. The flowers were perfect, the music was what we'd chosen, and for the first time all day, everything felt exactly as it should be. Michael's face when he saw me in my properly fitted dress, the one I'd actually selected and loved, told me everything I needed to know about how right our choices had been. Sophie's traditional alternative would have been beautiful on someone else, but it wouldn't have been me. This dress, with its subtle lace details and flowing silhouette, reflected who I actually was, rather than who Sophie thought I should be. During the ceremony, I found myself thinking about the morning's revelations and how they'd changed my understanding of my entire relationship with my sister. For years, I'd attributed Sophie's controlling behavior to her caring nature and desire to help. I'd made excuses for her tendency to override my preferences, telling myself that she just wanted what was best for me. Today had shown me that Sophie's helpfulness had always been about her need to feel superior, not about my actual well-being. The officiant asked Michael and me to share our personal vows, and as I looked into his eyes, I realized that Sophie's sabotage had actually strengthened my conviction about our relationship. She'd tried to prove that my judgment was flawed, but Michael's unwavering support through the crisis had confirmed that my most important decision, choosing him as my life partner, was absolutely sound. Michael, I began, my voice steady despite the emotional weight of the day. This morning tested us in ways we never expected. But watching you stand by me, believe in me, and fight alongside me to protect what we'd built together, showed me that I chose exactly the right person to share my life with. You didn't question my perspective or suggest I was overreacting. You simply asked what you could do to help, and then you did it. Michael's vows focused on partnership and trust, themes that felt especially meaningful given what we'd just been through. Emma, your grace under pressure today reminded me why I fell in love with you in the first place. You faced betrayal and manipulation with dignity and intelligence, never losing sight of what really mattered. I promise to always trust your judgment, support your decisions, and stand with you against anyone who tries to diminish your worth. As we exchanged rings, I caught sight of Daniel sitting in one of the back rows, looking both relieved and melancholy. His courage in exposing Sophie's crimes had saved not just my wedding, but potentially dozens of future victims. After the ceremony, I would need to thank him properly and make sure he had the support he needed to deal with the aftermath of his broken engagement. The reception began with cocktails on the garden terrace, and I was touched by how many guests approached me to comment on how beautiful everything looked. Several people specifically mentioned the peonies, saying they were much more interesting than the typical wedding roses. If they only knew how close they'd come to seeing those typical roses instead. My mother found me during the cocktail hour, looking more relaxed than she had all day. Emma, I owe you an apology. For years, I've been praising Sophie's initiative and encouraging you to be more assertive like her. I had no idea that what I was calling assertiveness was actually manipulation and control. Mom, you couldn't have known. Sophie was very careful to make her interference look helpful. But I should have paid more attention to how you felt about her help. I should have noticed that you often seemed uncomfortable when Sophie took charge of your decisions. I hugged my mother, feeling a weight lift that I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. What matters is that you see it now, and that you supported me today when I needed it most. My father joined our conversation, still looking shaken by the day's revelations. I keep thinking about Sophie's notebook, where she wrote that your wedding choices would embarrass the family. The only thing that would have embarrassed our family today was if we'd let her sabotage represent us instead of supporting your actual preferences. As the evening progressed, I found myself genuinely enjoying my wedding reception in a way I hadn't been sure would be possible after the morning's chaos. The lavender cake was a huge hit with guests, many of whom asked for the recipe. The garden setting looked magical as the sun began to set, and the live jazz trio we'd hired created exactly the romantic atmosphere Michael and I had envisioned. During dinner, Tyler, our photographer, approached me with his camera and a concerned expression. "Emma, I need to show you something. I was reviewing the photos from earlier today, and I found something unusual." He showed me a series of images on his camera's display screen. They were taken during the setup period, before I'd arrived at the venue, and they showed Sophie directing vendors with obvious authority. In one photo, she was pointing at floral arrangements while gesturing dismissively. In another, she was examining the cake table with a critical expression. "I wasn't sure if these would be useful, but given what happened today, I thought you might want them as documentation of her interference," Tyler explained. I studied the photos, seeing my sister's true attitude captured in candid moments when she thought no one was paying attention. Her body language in these images was completely different from the concerned, helpful demeanor she'd displayed when others were watching. These photos showed someone who was clearly in charge and enjoying her authority. "Tyler, these are perfect. Would you mind sending copies to Daniel? He's been documenting Sophie's pattern of manipulation, and these images support his evidence." "Of course. I'm just sorry I didn't realize what was happening when I was taking them." Daniel found me later during the dancing portion of the reception, looking like he needed to talk. We stepped away from the crowd to a quieter corner of the garden. "Emma, I wanted to let you know that I've been in contact with the district attorney's office, and they're very interested in the evidence I've compiled against Sophie. They think they have enough for multiple felony charges." "How are you feeling about all of this?" "Honestly, relieved. I've been carrying the weight of her threats for months, afraid that if I spoke up, she'd follow through on her promise to frame me for her crimes. Seeing her behavior toward you today made me realize that staying silent wasn't protecting anyone except Sophie." "What happens to your engagement now?" "It's over, obviously. I'm going to have to deal with the embarrassment of canceling a wedding and explaining to friends and family why, but that's a small price to pay for getting my life back." I studied Daniel's face, seeing exhaustion and relief in equal measure. "You know, if you need character witnesses when this goes to trial, Michael and I will testify about what we witnessed today." "Thank you. That means more than you know." As we talked, I noticed Sophie's friend Jessica approaching hesitantly. She looked uncomfortable and uncertain, clearly struggling with something she wanted to say. "Emma, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to apologize for this morning. I had no idea what Sophie was really doing, and I said some things that weren't fair to you. Jessica, you were working with the information Sophie gave you. I don't blame you for supporting your friend. But I should have questioned her stories more. Looking back, some of the things she said about you never seemed to match the person I've met at family gatherings. You've always seemed confident and capable, not anxious and overwhelmed like Sophie described." Jessica's apology highlighted something I'd been thinking about all day. Sophie's manipulation had been so thorough that she'd convinced multiple people, including some of my own family members, that I was incompetent and unreliable. The fact that she could create and maintain such a false narrative spoke to how skilled she was at psychological manipulation. "Jessica, has Sophie ever tried to manage or improve your decisions?" She thought for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Actually, yes. When I was planning my engagement party last year, she kept suggesting changes to my menu and decorations. She said my original ideas were too casual and that I should aim for something more sophisticated. At the time, I was grateful for her input, but now I'm wondering if she was just practicing her control techniques. What did you end up choosing? Her suggestions mostly. She was so confident about what would work better, and she made me doubt my own taste. My engagement party ended up looking beautiful, but it didn't feel like me at all. This conversation revealed another layer of Sophie's behavior that I hadn't fully considered. She hadn't limited her manipulation to me or her real estate clients. She'd been practicing these techniques on friends and family members for years, gradually building her skill at making people doubt their own judgment, while positioning herself as the authority on good taste and proper decision-making. The reception continued around us, but I found myself in several similar conversations with people who, after learning about Sophie's sabotage, began to reconsider their own interactions with her. My cousin Sarah mentioned that Sophie had convinced her to change her major in college, arguing that Sarah's original choice wasn't practical enough. My aunt mentioned that Sophie had repeatedly criticized her parenting choices, always framing the criticism as helpful guidance. As these stories accumulated, I realized that Sophie's behavior toward me wasn't unique, or even particularly focused. She had been systematically undermining the confidence and autonomy of multiple people in her life, always presenting herself as the knowledgeable helper, while making others feel inadequate and dependent on her guidance. This pattern explained why Sophie had been so successful at her real estate fraud. She had years of experience making people doubt their own judgment and rely on her supposed expertise. Her elderly clients probably felt grateful for her strong guidance, not realizing they were being manipulated and robbed. Late in the evening, as the reception was winding down, my phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer. Emma, this is Detective Rodriguez from the Portland Police Department. I'm calling because Daniel Hayes contacted us today about a fraud investigation involving your sister Sophie. I understand there was an incident at your wedding today that might be relevant to our case. I stepped away from the reception area to take the call privately. Yes, Detective. Sophie sabotaged multiple aspects of my wedding, and we have extensive documentation of her actions. Would you be willing to come in next week to give a formal statement? We're particularly interested in her pattern of manipulation and the methods she uses to undermine people's confidence in their own decision-making. Absolutely. Detective, how many victims are we talking about? Based on Mr. Hayes' evidence and our preliminary investigation, we've identified at least 15 clients who were defrauded, with total losses exceeding $300,000. But we suspect there may be more victims who haven't realized what happened to them yet. After hanging up with the detective, I rejoined the reception with a heavy heart. Sophie's crimes extended far beyond what I'd experienced today. She had systematically stolen from vulnerable people, using the same manipulation techniques she'd practiced on her own family and friends. As Michael and I prepared to leave for our honeymoon, my mother pulled me aside for one final conversation. Emma, I need you to know how proud I am of how you handled today. You could have given in to Sophie's pressure, accepted her changes, and avoided the confrontation. Instead, you fought for your own vision and exposed behavior that needed to be stopped. I almost didn't fight back, Mom. For a while this morning, I considered just letting her changes stand to avoid drama. What made you decide to push back? I thought about this carefully. I realized that if I let Sophie rewrite my wedding to match her preferences, I'd be starting my marriage by accepting that other people's opinions mattered more than my own judgment. That seemed like a terrible foundation for a partnership that's supposed to be based on mutual respect and trust. That's very wise, and it makes me confident that you and Michael are going to have a wonderful marriage. As we finally left the venue, I looked back at the garden where we'd celebrated, now decorated with the flowers I'd chosen, after eating the cake I'd selected, surrounded by people who had supported my actual preferences rather than Sophie's supposed improvements. The day had been beautiful not because everything went according to plan, but because we'd fought to restore our own vision when someone tried to replace it with theirs. 3 weeks later, I was sitting in the district attorney's office giving my formal statement about Sophie's wedding sabotage when the prosecutor shared some additional information about the case. Emma, I want you to know that your willingness to come forward has been crucial to our investigation. Several of Sophie's real estate clients have now contacted us after seeing news coverage of her arrest. Your testimony about her manipulation methods helped them recognize that they'd been victims of the same techniques. How is she responding to the charges? She's maintaining her innocence and claiming that all her actions were well-intentioned attempts to help people make better decisions. She seems genuinely unable to understand why people are upset with her for what she sees as superior judgment and helpful guidance. This response didn't surprise me. Even during our confrontation at my parents' house, Sophie had shown no real understanding of why her actions were wrong. She seemed to believe that her taste and judgment were objectively superior to everyone else's, and that this superiority gave her the right to override other people's choices. 6 months after my wedding, Sophie was convicted on 12 counts of fraud and sentenced to 4 years in prison. Daniel testified about her blackmail scheme, I testified about her manipulation methods, and several of her real estate clients testified about the financial and emotional damage she'd caused. During the sentencing hearing, Sophie was given the opportunity to address the court. Her statement was revealing in its complete lack of genuine remorse. "I never intended to hurt anyone," she said. "Everything I did was to help people avoid making mistakes they would regret later. If people are upset with me for trying to improve their situations, that's their choice, but I don't believe I did anything wrong." The judge's response was pointed. "Ms. Chen, your inability to recognize that other people have the right to make their own choices, even if you disagree with those choices, is exactly what makes you dangerous to the community. Your pattern of manipulation and control has caused significant financial and emotional harm to multiple victims." After the sentencing, Daniel and I met for coffee to discuss the conclusion of the case. He looked healthier and more relaxed than I'd seen him since before my wedding. "How are you feeling about everything?" I asked. "Like I can finally breathe again. For months, I felt trapped by Sophie's threats and manipulation. Now that she's facing consequences for her actions, I feel like I got my life back." "Any regrets about how everything played out?" "Only that I didn't speak up sooner. If I'd reported her fraud when I first discovered it, your wedding might not have been sabotaged, and some of her later victims might have been protected. You did what you could with the information and constraints you had at the time. The important thing is that you eventually found the courage to expose her." As we talked, I reflected on how much my understanding of my relationship with Sophie had changed over the past months. For years, I'd attributed her controlling behavior to sisterly concern, and had made excuses for her tendency to override my preferences. The wedding sabotage had forced me to see that Sophie's behavior was actually rooted in a deep need to feel superior and in control. This realization had changed more than just my relationship with Sophie. It had made me more confident in my own judgment, and more willing to trust my instincts when something felt wrong. I'd learned to recognize manipulation tactics and to value my own perspective, even when others tried to convince me it was flawed. Michael and I had used our honeymoon to process the emotional impact of the wedding day revelations, and we'd both agreed that the crisis had actually strengthened our relationship. We'd seen how we functioned as a team under pressure, and we'd confirmed that we shared the same values about honesty, respect, and mutual support. A year after our wedding, Michael and I received an unexpected letter from Sophie in prison. In it, she maintained that she had been trying to help me and that she still believed her wedding choices would have been superior to mine. But she also expressed what seemed like genuine sadness about the damage to our family relationships. "I miss having a sister," she wrote. "I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I hope someday you'll understand that everything I did came from a place of caring, even if I expressed it badly." I showed the letter to my therapist, who I'd been seeing to process the complex emotions around Sophie's betrayal and incarceration. "How does reading this make you feel?" she asked. "Sad, but not guilty," I replied. "I can see that Sophie is lonely and regretful, but she's still not taking real responsibility for what she did. She's still framing her manipulation and fraud as caring that was just expressed badly, rather than acknowledging that she violated other people's autonomy and rights. Do you think you'll respond to her letter?" "I don't think so, at least not now. Maybe someday we can have a relationship again, but only if she develops genuine insight into why her behavior was harmful. Right now, she's still the same person who thought she had the right to rewrite my wedding because she didn't approve of my choices." 2 years after the wedding, I received a call from one of Sophie's former clients. an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson, who had testified at Sophie's trial. She had tracked down my contact information to thank me for coming forward about Sophie's manipulation methods. "Dear, your testimony helped me understand that what happened to me wasn't my fault," Mrs. Patterson said. "For months after I realized Sophie had stolen my money, I blamed myself for being too trusting or too naive. Learning about how she manipulated your wedding choices helped me see that she was skilled at making people doubt themselves. It wasn't a reflection of my intelligence or judgment. This conversation reminded me that Sophie's crimes had extended far beyond financial fraud. She had systematically undermined people's confidence in their own decision-making abilities, making them feel inadequate and dependent on her guidance. The psychological damage she'd caused was as significant as the financial losses. Today, 5 years after my wedding, I can look back on that day with gratitude rather than anger. Yes, Sophie's sabotage created chaos and stress that nearly ruined what should have been a joyful celebration, but it also forced me to fight for my own vision, to recognize manipulation when I saw it, and to trust my own judgment even when others tried to convince me it was flawed. The wedding we ultimately had after recovering from Sophie's interference was exactly what Michael and I had wanted. The peonies were beautiful, the lavender cake was delicious, and my dress fit perfectly because it was chosen by someone who actually knew my body and my style preferences. More importantly, the day taught me that standing up for my own choices, even when it's difficult or uncomfortable, is essential to living authentically. Sophie is scheduled for release next year, and I still don't know if or how we'll rebuild our relationship. My parents have maintained limited contact with her, and they've shared that she seems to be developing some insight into her behavior through prison counseling programs. But insight and genuine change are two different things, and I'll need to see consistent evidence of real transformation before I'm willing to trust her with any significant role in my life. What I do know is that I'm no longer the person who would quietly accept someone else's improvements to my choices out of politeness or family loyalty. Sophie's sabotage taught me that my own judgment is valuable and worth defending, and that lesson has made me stronger in every area of my life. The irony is that Sophie set out to prove her superiority by demonstrating how much better her choices were than mine. Instead, she proved that her willingness to violate other people's autonomy and manipulate their decisions made her fundamentally untrustworthy. Her supposed superior judgment led her to prison, while the choices she tried to improve led me to a happy marriage and a stronger sense of self. Sometimes the best gift someone can give you is showing you exactly who they really are, even when that revelation is painful. Sophie's wedding sabotage was her gift to me, though I'm certain it wasn't the gift she intended to give. The morning after our wedding, I woke up in our hotel suite with a profound sense of peace I hadn't expected after the chaos of the previous day. Michael was still sleeping beside me, and sunlight was streaming through the windows overlooking the Willamette River. For the first time in months, I felt completely in control of my own life and decisions. My phone showed 17 missed calls and 43 text messages, most from relatives who had heard various versions of what had happened with Sophie. Word travels fast in families, especially when it involves criminal activity and wedding drama. I scrolled through the messages, noting how the story had already begun to shift and change as it passed from person to person. My Aunt Carol had texted, "Heard about Sophie's breakdown at your wedding. So sorry you had to deal with that stress on your special day." My cousin Mark wrote, "Mom said Sophie had some kind of mental health crisis and disrupted your ceremony. Hope you're okay." These messages revealed how quickly Sophie's criminal behavior was being reframed as mental illness or emotional instability rather than deliberate fraud and manipulation. I realized this would be an ongoing challenge. Sophie had spent years building a reputation as the helpful, competent sister, and many family members would find it easier to believe she'd had a temporary breakdown rather than accept that she'd been systematically manipulating people for months or years. The cognitive dissonance of reconciling their image of Sophie with the reality of her crimes would lead many people to minimize or reinterpret what had actually happened. Michael stirred beside me and immediately reached for his own phone. "How bad is it?" he asked, noting my expression. "The family gossip network is in full swing, and the story is already being sanitized. Half the messages are treating this like Sophie had a wedding day meltdown, rather than acknowledging the fraud and manipulation. Are you going to correct the record? I considered this carefully. Part of me wanted to respond to every text with the full truth about Sophie's crimes and the evidence we'd gathered. But I also recognized that some family members weren't ready to hear that information, and others might never be willing to accept it regardless of the evidence. I think I'll respond selectively, I decided. The people who are genuinely concerned and asking real questions deserve honest answers. The ones who are just fishing for gossip or trying to downplay what happened don't need my energy. Over the next few hours, as we prepared for our honeymoon departure, I had several phone conversations with family members who wanted to understand what had really happened. These conversations were revealing in terms of how different people processed shocking information about someone they thought they knew. My grandmother, who had always been Sophie's biggest champion, struggled the most with the revelations. Emma, dear, are you absolutely certain about these accusations? Sophie has always been such a helpful child. Maybe there's been some misunderstanding. Grandma, we have documented evidence of her forging my signature, lying to vendors, and stealing money from her real estate clients. Daniel recorded her admitting to the wedding sabotage, and the police have financial records proving the fraud. But why would she do such things? It doesn't make sense. This was the question everyone kept asking, and it was the hardest one to answer because it required accepting that Sophie's motivations were fundamentally different from what we'd all assumed. For years, we'd interpreted her controlling behavior as caring and her manipulation as helpfulness. Recognizing that she was actually driven by a need to feel superior and in control meant re-examining every interaction we'd ever had with her. I think Sophie genuinely believes she knows better than everyone else, and she's gotten into the habit of overriding other people's choices when she disagrees with them, I explained. Over time, that pattern escalated into criminal behavior when she started applying the same logic to her clients' financial decisions. My Uncle David, who worked in finance, had a different perspective when I spoke with him. Emma, what you're describing sounds like someone with a personality disorder. The grandiosity, the manipulation, the complete lack of empathy for her victims, it's textbook narcissistic behavior. Do you think that excuses what she did? Not at all. But it might explain why she seems so genuinely confused about why everyone was upset with her. People with certain personality disorders often can't understand that other people have valid perspectives that differ from their own. These conversations helped me understand that Sophie's behavior wasn't just criminal. It was pathological. She hadn't set out to hurt people out of malice, but rather because she literally couldn't comprehend that other people's preferences and judgments might be equally valid to her own. This didn't excuse her actions, but it did explain why she'd seemed so genuinely baffled by the negative reactions to her help. 3 days into our honeymoon in Hawaii, I received a call from Detective Rodriguez with an update on the investigation. Emma, I wanted to let you know that we've now identified 23 victims of Sophie's real estate fraud, with total losses exceeding $400,000. Your testimony about her manipulation methods has been crucial in helping other victims recognize what happened to them. Have you learned anything new about her methods? We've discovered that she had a very sophisticated system for identifying vulnerable targets. She specifically sought out elderly clients who were dealing with major life transitions like downsizing, moving to assisted living, or settling estates after a death. These people were already feeling overwhelmed and uncertain, which made them more susceptible to her manipulation. This information made me think about Sophie's wedding sabotage in a new light. She'd positioned me as someone who was overwhelmed and anxious about wedding planning, making vendors feel like they needed to trust her judgment instead of mine. It was the same technique she used with her elderly clients, just applied to a different context. Detective, do you think there might be other types of victims beyond her real estate clients? People she manipulated in personal relationships or other business contexts? That's actually what I wanted to talk to you about. We've received several calls from people who attended your wedding and heard about the investigation. Apparently, Sophie has been involved in manipulating other people's event planning, financial decisions, and even career choices over the years. We're trying to determine if any of these incidents might constitute additional criminal activity. After hanging up with the detective, I sat on our hotel balcony overlooking Waikiki Beach, trying to process the scope of Sophie's impact on the people around her. It wasn't just about my wedding or her real estate clients. She had been systematically undermining people's confidence and autonomy for years, always positioning herself as the knowledgeable helper, while making others feel incompetent. Michael joined me on the balcony with 2 cups of coffee. "You look like you're processing something heavy." I'm realizing that Sophie's manipulation probably affected dozens of people over the years, and most of them probably never recognized what was happening. They just felt bad about their own judgment and grateful for her guidance. Do you feel guilty about not seeing it sooner? I considered this question carefully. I feel sad that I spent so many years making excuses for behavior that was actually harmful, but I don't feel guilty exactly. Sophie was very skilled at making her manipulation look like caring, and she had years of practice perfecting her techniques. What bothers you most about it? That she made me doubt my own judgment for so long. Every time I disagreed with her suggestions or felt uncomfortable with her interference, she made me feel like I was being ungrateful or irrational. I internalized the message that my preferences weren't as valid as hers. This was the deeper damage Sophie had caused, beyond the wedding sabotage and financial fraud. She had systematically eroded my confidence in my own decision-making abilities, making me second-guess choices that were actually perfectly reasonable. The wedding crisis had forced me to fight back and trust my own judgment, but I was still discovering areas where her influence had made me doubt myself unnecessarily. When we returned from our honeymoon 2 weeks later, I found several letters waiting for me from people who had learned about the investigation into Sophie's activities. One was from Jessica, Sophie's former best friend, who wanted to share her own experiences with Sophie's manipulation. "Emma," she wrote, "learning about what Sophie did to your wedding made me realize that she's been controlling my decisions for years, without me recognizing it. She convinced me to break up with my college boyfriend because she said he wasn't ambitious enough. She talked me out of applying for graduate programs she thought were beneath me. She even influenced my choice of apartment, arguing that my preferred neighborhood wasn't safe enough. I always thought she was just looking out for me, but now I see that she was systematically replacing my judgment with hers." Another letter came from a former coworker of Sophie's who had worked with her at a previous real estate agency. "I left that job because Sophie kept undermining my client relationships," the woman wrote. "She would contact my clients behind my back, claiming she was just trying to help, but always suggesting changes to their purchase decisions that would redirect their business to her instead. When I complained to management, she made it seem like I was being paranoid and unprofessional. I started doubting my own perceptions and eventually quit, rather than deal with the constant stress." These letters painted a picture of Sophie as someone who had been refining her manipulation techniques for years across multiple contexts. She hadn't suddenly become a criminal fraudster. She had gradually escalated from interpersonal manipulation to financial fraud as her confidence in her own superiority grew. I decided to contact some of these letter writers to better understand the full scope of Sophie's impact. My conversation with her former coworker was particularly illuminating. "The thing about Sophie," the woman explained, "is that she was incredibly good at making you feel like you needed her guidance. She would identify areas where you felt uncertain or insecure, then position herself as the expert who could help you make better decisions. But her help always seemed to benefit her more than it benefited you. Did other people at your workplace see what she was doing? Some did, but others thought she was just being helpful and proactive." Sophie was careful to maintain good relationships with supervisors and clients, so when conflicts arose, she usually had more credibility than her targets did. This pattern of cultivating authority figures while undermining peers was consistent with what I'd observed in Sophie's personal relationships. She had always been careful to maintain her image with our parents and other family members, making it easy for them to dismiss any complaints about her behavior as sibling rivalry or misunderstanding. 6 weeks after the wedding, I attended Sophie's arraignment hearing. I hadn't planned to go, but Daniel had asked me to be there for moral support, and I felt obligated to see the legal process through. Watching Sophie in handcuffs, wearing a standard orange jumpsuit instead of her usual carefully coordinated outfits, was surreal. Her lawyer entered a plea of not guilty and requested psychological evaluation, arguing that Sophie's behavior might be the result of mental illness rather than criminal intent. This strategy didn't surprise me, but it did concern me. I worried that a mental health defense might minimize the impact on her victims and reduce the consequences for her actions. During a break in the proceedings, I overheard Sophie talking to her lawyer about her case strategy. "I never intended to hurt anyone," she was saying. "Everything I did was to help people make better choices. If they're upset about the outcomes, that's their problem, not mine." Even facing serious criminal charges, Sophie maintained that her actions had been justified and beneficial. She showed no genuine remorse or understanding of why her victims felt violated and betrayed. This conversation convinced me that her crimes weren't the result of temporary poor judgment or mental health issues, but rather reflected her fundamental inability to respect other people's autonomy. 3 months after the wedding, Sophie's case went to trial. I testified about her wedding sabotage, focusing on her manipulation methods and complete lack of remorse when confronted. Daniel testified about her blackmail scheme and the evidence he'd gathered of her real estate fraud. Multiple elderly victims testified about the financial and emotional damage she'd caused. Sophie's defense team tried to portray her as someone who genuinely cared about helping people, but had poor judgment about boundaries and appropriate behavior. They brought in a psychiatrist who diagnosed her with narcissistic personality disorder and argued that her condition impaired her ability to understand the impact of her actions on others. The prosecution countered that regardless of any personality disorder, Sophie had demonstrated clear understanding of right and wrong through her elaborate efforts to conceal her fraud and manipulation. They pointed out that she had forged documents, lied to authorities, and threatened victims who tried to expose her, all of which indicated conscious wrongdoing rather than impaired judgment. During Sophie's testimony, she maintained her position that she had been trying to help people, but her answers revealed the depth of her inability to empathize with her victims. When asked how she felt about the elderly clients who had lost their life savings due to her fraud, she responded, "I feel bad that they're upset, but they would have made poor financial decisions anyway. At least with my guidance, some of their money went to someone who would use it wisely." This statement was so callous and self-serving that I saw several jury members visibly react with shock and disgust. Sophie seemed genuinely unable to understand why stealing money from vulnerable people was wrong, even when the money was their entire life savings. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Sophie was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison and ordered to pay full restitution to her victims. The judge's comments during sentencing were particularly pointed. "Ms. Chen, your actions represent a profound violation of trust and human dignity," the judge said. "You systematically targeted vulnerable people, exploited their uncertainties, and stole their financial security for your own benefit. Your complete lack of remorse and continued belief that your actions were justified make you a danger to the community." After the sentencing, I spoke briefly with several of Sophie's victims. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman whose story had particularly moved me, thanked me for my testimony. "Dear, seeing someone Sophie's own age stand up and tell the truth about her behavior gave me confidence that I wasn't being paranoid or vindictive," she said. "For months, I wondered if I was just a bitter old woman who couldn't accept that I'd made poor decisions. Your testimony helped me understand that what happened to me was real and wrong. This conversation reinforced my belief that speaking up about Sophie's manipulation had been the right choice, even though it had caused significant family disruption and personal stress. Her victims deserved validation and justice, and her pattern of behavior needed to be exposed before she could harm additional people." In the year following Sophie's conviction, I continued to receive occasional contact from people who had experienced her manipulation in various contexts. A former neighbor wrote to tell me that Sophie had convinced her to fire a home contractor and hire Sophie's preferred alternative, who had done shoddy work and overcharged for the project. A college acquaintance revealed that Sophie had interfered in her relationship with a boyfriend, eventually breaking them up by systematically undermining the woman's confidence in her partner's commitment. These stories confirmed that Sophie's manipulation had extended far beyond criminal fraud into virtually every area of her life. She had been practicing her techniques on friends, family, neighbors, and coworkers for years, always positioning herself as the helpful expert while making others doubt their own judgment. 2 years after the wedding, I received my first communication from Sophie herself. It was a letter sent from federal prison, carefully written in her familiar, neat handwriting. "Emma," she wrote, I've been thinking a lot about what happened between us, and I want you to know that I'm sorry for disrupting your wedding. I realize now that I should have respected your choices, even if I disagreed with them. The prison counseling program has helped me understand that I have problems with boundaries and control, and I'm working on developing better interpersonal skills. The letter continued for several pages, but it was notable for what it didn't include. Sophie apologized for disrupting my wedding, but not for the months of systematic sabotage that preceded it. She acknowledged having boundary issues, but didn't take responsibility for deliberate fraud and manipulation. She expressed regret for the conflict between us, but showed no genuine understanding of the harm she'd caused to her many victims. I showed the letter to my therapist, who had been helping me process the complex emotions around Sophie's betrayal and the family dynamics that had enabled her behavior. "How does reading this make you feel?" my therapist asked. "Frustrated," I replied. "It's the same pattern she's always shown. She acknowledges just enough wrongdoing to seem reasonable, but she minimizes the severity of her actions and avoids taking real responsibility for the harm she caused." "Do you think she's capable of genuine change?" "I honestly don't know. The psychiatric evaluation during her trial suggested that her personality disorder makes it very difficult for her to develop real empathy or insight into her impact on others. She might learn to modify her behavior to avoid negative consequences, but I'm not sure she'll ever truly understand why what she did was wrong." This uncertainty made it difficult to envision any future relationship with Sophie, even if she eventually expressed more complete remorse and understanding. How could I trust that it was genuine, rather than another manipulation designed to achieve her current goals? 3 years after the wedding, Sophie was released on parole after serving 3 years of her 5-year sentence. My parents visited her immediately after her release, and they reported that she seemed subdued and grateful for their support. She had found a job at a nonprofit organization that helped ex-offenders with housing and employment, work that my parents saw as evidence of her commitment to making amends. "She seems really different, Emma," my mother told me during a phone call. "More humble, more aware of how her actions affected other people. I think the prison experience taught her some important lessons." I was skeptical of this assessment, but I tried to remain open to the possibility that Sophie might have developed genuine insight during her incarceration. When she requested a meeting 6 months after her release, I agreed to see her, with Michael present for support and perspective. We met at a neutral location, a coffee shop in downtown Portland that neither of us had any personal connection to. Sophie arrived exactly on time, dressed modestly, and without the designer accessories she had always favored. She looked older and more worn than I remembered, but her demeanor was calm and composed. "Emma, thank you for agreeing to see me," she began. "I know I have no right to ask for your time or attention after what I did." "What do you want to discuss, Sophie?" "I want to apologize for everything I did to hurt you in your wedding. I've spent a lot of time in counseling, and I'm beginning to understand how my need to control everything around me damaged my relationships with people I love." I listened as Sophie described her prison counseling experience and the insights she claimed to have developed about her behavior patterns. She used appropriate therapeutic language and seemed to understand the concepts of boundaries, consent, and respect for others' autonomy. But something about her presentation felt rehearsed rather than genuine. She hit all the right notes about accountability and personal growth, but her words felt calculated rather than heartfelt. More concerning, she still seemed to view her manipulation as primarily a problem for her, rather than recognizing the genuine harm she'd caused to her victims. "Sophie," I said finally, "I appreciate that you've been working on understanding your behavior, but I need to know if you understand the impact you had on other people, not just how your actions affected your own life. Of course I understand that people were hurt by my choices. That's what I'm trying to make amends for. Can you tell me specifically what you think you did to Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who lost $60,000 because of your fraud?" Sophie paused, and I could see her struggling to find the right words. "I made financial decisions for her that she didn't fully understand or consent to. I took advantage of her trust and my professional expertise." This response was technically accurate but emotionally vacant. Sophie could describe what she had done in clinical terms, but she showed no real understanding of the terror and humiliation Mrs. Patterson had experienced, when she realized her life savings had been stolen by someone she trusted. What about the other victims? Do you understand what it felt like for them to discover that someone they trusted had been manipulating and robbing them? I know that my actions caused financial hardship and emotional distress for many people. That's why I'm committed to paying full restitution and working in victim services to help other people who have been harmed. Again, Sophie's answer was technically appropriate but lacked genuine emotional understanding. She could identify the categories of harm she had caused, but she seemed unable to truly comprehend the human impact of her crimes. As our conversation continued, I realized that while Sophie had learned to use the language of accountability and recovery, she hadn't developed genuine empathy for her victims. She understood intellectually that her actions had been wrong, but she still seemed to view the harm she'd caused as an unfortunate side effect of her good intentions, rather than recognizing that her intentions had been fundamentally selfish. Sophie, I said finally, I think you've made progress in understanding some aspects of your behavior, but I don't think you're ready for a relationship with me or with the family members you manipulated. Until you can genuinely understand and feel the pain you caused other people, rather than just acknowledging it intellectually, I don't think you can be trusted not to repeat these patterns. Sophie's composed facade cracked slightly, and I caught a glimpse of the anger and entitlement that had always driven her behavior. I've done everything the counselors told me to do, she said with visible frustration. I've acknowledged my mistakes. I'm paying restitution. I'm working to help other victims. What more do you want from me? This reaction confirmed my suspicions about the superficial nature of her apparent growth. Sophie was going through the motions of accountability because she'd been told it was necessary for rebuilding relationships. But she still fundamentally believed that she was entitled to forgiveness and reconciliation, simply because she had completed the required steps. I want you to genuinely understand why what you did was wrong, not just know that other people think it was wrong, I replied. I want you to feel actual remorse for the harm you caused, not just regret that your actions had negative consequences for you. Sophie stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her calculating whether there was anything she could say to achieve her desired outcome. When she realized that no amount of therapeutic language or appropriate responses would convince me to resume a relationship with her, her mask slipped entirely. You know what, Emma? I think you're being unreasonable. I've done everything possible to make amends, and you're still punishing me because you can't let go of old grievances. Maybe the problem isn't just with me. This response revealed that Sophie's fundamental character hadn't changed at all. When her manipulation tactics failed to achieve her goals, she immediately reverted to blaming her victims and positioning herself as the injured party. She had learned to mimic accountability and remorse, but underneath the therapeutic language, she was still the same person who believed her judgment was superior to everyone else's. Michael and I left the coffee shop without agreeing to any future contact with Sophie. As we drove home, I felt a mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness because any hope of rebuilding a genuine relationship with my sister was effectively gone, but relief because I no longer had to wonder whether she might have truly changed. How are you feeling about that conversation? Michael asked. Clear, I replied. For the first time since this whole situation began, I feel completely clear about who Sophie is and what she's capable of. She's learned to say the right words, but she hasn't developed the capacity for genuine empathy or remorse. She's still fundamentally the same person who thought she had the right to rewrite my wedding because she disagreed with my choices. 5 years after our wedding, Michael and I have built a life together that feels authentic and fulfilling in ways I couldn't have imagined when I was still under Sophie's influence. We make decisions together as equal partners. We trust each other's judgment, and we support each other's individual preferences, even when we don't fully understand them. The crisis Sophie created on our wedding day taught me to value my own perspective and to recognize manipulation when I see it. These skills have served me well in other areas of my life, making me more confident in my career, more discerning in my friendships, and more effective at setting boundaries with people who try to override my preferences. I still receive occasional updates about Sophie through family members who maintain limited contact with her. She continues to work in victim services and maintains the appearance of someone who has learned from her mistakes. But based on my last conversation with her, I believe she views her current role more as a way to demonstrate her rehabilitation to others than as genuine service to people who have been harmed. Some family members have suggested that I should give Sophie another chance, arguing that people can change and that holding grudges is unhealthy. But I've learned to distinguish between forgiveness and trust. I can forgive Sophie for the harm she caused me without trusting her not to cause similar harm in the future. And I can wish her well in her rehabilitation without inviting her back into my life. The wedding sabotage that seemed so devastating at the time ultimately became a gift, though not one I would have chosen. It forced me to fight for my own vision, to trust my own judgment, and to recognize that some people will always prioritize their need for control over respect for others' autonomy. These lessons have made me stronger, more confident, and more capable of protecting myself and the people I love from manipulation and abuse. Today, when I look at our wedding photos, I see the flowers I chose, the dress I selected, and the joyful faces of people who supported our actual preferences rather than someone else's idea of what we should want. More importantly, I see two people who learned to trust each other completely and to value their partnership above all the external pressures and false authorities that had once seemed so important. Sophie's attempt to prove her superiority by improving my choices ultimately demonstrated the opposite. Her manipulative, controlling approach to relationships led to isolation, criminal conviction, and broken family bonds, while my approach of mutual respect and authentic decision-making led to a strong marriage and genuine connections with people who value honesty over image management. The woman who walked down that aisle 5 years ago was not the anxious, incompetent person Sophie had tried to convince everyone I was. She was someone who had learned to fight for her own vision, to trust her own judgment, and to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than manipulation and control. And that foundation has proven strong enough to support the beautiful life Michael and I have built together. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.